is. So I'm going to, skim a little bit on what Scrum is, but definitely talk about Scrum in terms of what is useful and what is not useful. But I'll also go over the kind of the key points of Scrum just to make sure that just because you've heard about it, maybe if you use it a little bit, I want to make sure you kind of have the foundational concepts right there. So in terms of, again, as just a reminder, there's a collaboration framework, how to coordinate with other teams is kind of the second aspect that's really important in the machine learning team process, right? So we have the life cycle that we're going to define, so we have a common vocabulary, but then how do we actually figure out what to do? That's what we need this coordination process for. And there's different ways to coordinate. Kanban, which I won't spend a lot of time on, everybody's heard about it, but Kanban really is just, it's not a defined framework. It's just a principle to be lean, and it's a way to show what's work is happening. But it doesn't say, for example, how to prioritize tasks on the Kanban board. Scrum, we've talked about, and I'll talk about more in data-driven Scrum. So those are just some examples. There are others as well. So none of this is, fully defined or anything like that. There's only so much we can do in the few hours we have together here. But hopefully this will give you enough to either confirm what you have is good or maybe give you some incentive to maybe try to improve some things. So I think we had like 92% of the people that either said they knew Scrum or used Scrum, but I want to get a better sense of kind of your knowledge of Scrum before I start going into it. So, obviously most people have heard about it before today, but feel free to pick that one if you think that's most appropriate. And again, what I meant by before today is before you read anything about this session. So the second choice is you've heard of it, but didn't really know what it was. Maybe, you might have known it was useful for prioritizing projects or useful for executing projects, but didn't know any real details about it is what I mean there. The third option, C, you've seen it, you've kind of talked to people that have used it, you have kind of maybe some understanding of how it's used, but you've never actually used it in a project. And finally, you've used it in a project one or more times and have a pretty good sense of what it is. And the last one is a Scrum Master. So if you don't know what a Scrum Master is, you're not one, but at a high level, a Scrum Master is a process expert. So you're so knowledgeable about Scrum, you can facilitate your whole team using Scrum. So I'll give people a couple of more seconds to kind of give me a better understanding of how much they know about Scrum. And this will help me figure out how much in depth I go and things like that. And I'm also just curious, as I do these, trying to get an understanding of kind of people's backgrounds and expertise. All right, so I think we've got people are still filling in. I'll give another maybe 5 seconds here for people to give me some context, and then we'll go forward. All right, so let's see here. So not surprisingly, everybody's heard about it. That's consistent with what we've heard before. So some people just heard about it a little bit. A third of the folks are Scrum Masters, so these are people that really know Scrum really well. I didn't ask whether you used it for data projects or software projects or something else. But the vast majority have kind of a working knowledge of Scrum, so I think that'll be really helpful. As I said, I'll go over kind of the foundational parts for the quarter of the folks here that really haven't used Scrum before, but also as a way to level set, and I'll try to talk about it in data science context. So thanks for giving me that context. So as I mentioned before, Scrum has been around for a long time, since the 1990s. It's by far the most popular framework for software development projects, but it's used in other areas as well. So, for example, I have friends that use it in operating rooms, for example. So it doesn't have to be in technology-related things. It's just a way to coordinate people and how they can kind of move forward. The focus is on defining and executing a sprint. A sprint is a small burst of work. It's an iteration. And you iterate to get the desired results. Kind of in a nutshell, that's what Scrum is. We'll kind of talk through it. So there's a couple different kind of classic pictures that talk about Scrum. This is one of them. As I mentioned before, Scrum teams break work into small bursts. That's called a sprint. They deliver each sprint via kind of defining the sprint being kind of small tasks. And the key, again, this is about agility, is you revise what you're going to do going next based on the results of that sprint. So you might think you know what you're going to do in the next 4 sprints, but the truth is after each sprint you reprioritize, you take a look and you learn and you go forward. And that's that agility that I mentioned earlier in this session. So the picture here, I'll kind of quickly highlight and summarize this. So again, the product backlog is the different ideas of what you could do in a sprint. You can think of these as different features, maybe different capabilities that you want to add to a system. Then the sprint backlog is what you're going to do. Each sprint is a fixed duration. So within a project, the team might decide we're going to do 1 week sprints. That's actually pretty typical these days. Some teams do 2 week sprints. Almost nobody does 4 week sprints anymore. But what I would say is that the key part about Scrum is that every sprint will be 2 weeks if they're 2 weeks. So throughout the entire project, you're going to do 2 week sprints. Or throughout the entire project, you're going to do 1 week sprints. You don't get to kind of choose that this sprint's going to be 1 week, next sprint's going to be 2 weeks, and things like that. You can't do that. And typically, there are weekly increments just to kind of simplify the process of when meetings are and things like that. The team meets daily just to see if there's any issues, and I'll talk about what those meetings are. And the team outputs something that is potentially a shippable increment. And as I mentioned before, when we're doing iterations in a data science context, what I like to think about is that an iteration or a sprint, if you're using Scrum, should be you're answering a question, and that question makes sense from a client's perspective, from a product owner's perspective, from a stakeholder's perspective. And so that's what we like to think about as usable. From a data science perspective, it's usable if we're answering the question. Here's pretty much the exact same picture. Really, the only reason I included this is I included a date, right? So you can see roughly almost 20 years ago, this picture really hasn't changed that much, right? So we have ideas about what to do. We break one idea into lots of little tasks to do in a sprint. Many teams use a Kanban board to track the sprint backlog. Then we're going to do 2 week sprints. We have our daily meeting, which is every day. In the end, we get something shippable. So you can kind of get a sense that Scrum has been growing in popularity, but fairly stable in what it needs. I mean, that's good and bad. I'm not trying to, just like Chris BM has been around for that long. So both of these have been around for a while, and they've withstood the test of time, I think is a good way to think about it. One key aspect of a sprint that some people don't realize, that if they haven't kind of used it before, is that once you start a sprint, if it's for 2 weeks, like that's pretty much defined. You can't be like, we're 2 days into a sprint and we realize that something else is really important and we should kind of add it to the sprint. That's not how it works. You kind of agree that we're going to do this work in this sprint, and then based on what we learn, we can prioritize future sprints, and that's great, and we should always do that. But we shouldn't add to what's in the sprint, and we shouldn't reprioritize a sprint. The only thing you can do is sometimes it makes sense to cancel the sprint. Totally just stop it and restart something else. But this idea of like incrementally adding something, that's not part of what Scrum says you can do in a sprint. So here is like, again, I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes on Scrum. We could have spent 2 whole days on Scrum. All the Scrum masters have most likely spent 2 days learning about Scrum. But I'm just giving you a high-level concepts of what it is. And we'll talk about the roles of the team, the ceremonies, which are kind of like meetings, and then some of the key artifacts. So there's 3 roles, and I've kind of talked about these implicitly, but I think this is a good chance to take a step back and explain what they are. So the product owner. So this is the person that is the voice of the customer, the voice of the client. This is the person that kind of integrates all the views of different stakeholders. It's, if you will, the main stakeholder. It's the person that is accountable to the other stakeholders. So it doesn't have to be the most senior stakeholder, but it's the person that's accountable for all the other stakeholders. And what this person does, what this role does, to be more precise, it's the person that prioritizes what to be done. So it's not the technical team that's prioritizing what's to be done. It's the product owner. So if you remember, as we were thinking about starting a sprint, there was like all these different choices of what to do. And that's good. There should be lots of choices. And at the end of a sprint, we prioritize based on what we've learned. And lots of people input into that decision. The entire team kind of provides insights about what we should do next and why we should do this or why we shouldn't do that. But at the end of the day, the product owner, not a VP of something, not the chief data scientist if it's a data project. It's the product owner based on everybody's input that defines and is accountable for this prioritization. And by having this person accountable for what's being prioritized, they're accountable to the other stakeholders to make sure that the team's working on the right things. And the technical team is responsible to make sure that the trade-offs are understood correctly. How long things take, what the potential value might be. That's obviously something that is not done purely by the product owner. But at the end of the day, it's the product owner that prioritizes. and is accountable to make sure that, there was a question before about, maybe I don't know all the stakeholders. That product owner needs to know all the stakeholders, right? That's important. So the Scrum Master, I like to think of this as being the process expert, if you will. So some people mistake this for being the manager of the team. And these are roles, so different people can do it. But this is the person that just facilitates the process, kind of reminds people that we need to kind of do these different meetings and what the role of each meeting is, and how to improve our process. And reminds people kind of how the process works and what the value is and how to kind of improve it. But doesn't have to be somebody senior. It has to be somebody that understands the process. It's a big difference there. And then finally, it's the rest of the team, right? So whether that's programmers, data scientists, data engineers, whatever the case might be, that's a technical team. And that's typically 5, 6, 7 people, something like that. It could be smaller, obviously. The other thing to point out that these are roles, not people. So a Scrum Master can also be part of the development team. That's totally appropriate. But they have kind of that Scrum Master hat on, if you will, at various times in the project. So iteration through a life cycle. So I kind of define this life cycle at a very high level. And we can kind of you can think about requirements, design, code, test. So that can kind of work for software as well as data science, as well as many other fields. And the key to think through this, and this was related to the question about should an iteration kind of cover all aspects of a data science life cycle, is you want to think of an iteration as potentially possibly going through all of them. But if not, you're at least doing something that touches what makes sense for what you're trying to achieve in this iteration. But what you definitely do not want to do is be perfect on requirements before you go to design. Be perfect on design before you go to code. Be perfect on code before you go to test. Because that's more of a waterfall approach. So if people have heard about a waterfall approach, that really is what it is. And the goal here is you do a little bit across all of this, maybe through multiple iterations. And so you're learning, and you're kind of, by doing some coding, for example, you're learning better about what the requirements should be. And that makes intuitive sense in a data science perspective, right? So by learning about the predictive value of what data is available, you might refine what the requirements are for that predictive model, as a simple example. So the goal is not to do it where you're perfect in one before the other. Now, whether you do all of these, that's, in a software context, typically the answer is yes. In a data science context, it might not make sense to do all of these, but you definitely can want to think about each iteration answering a question that makes sense or refining something to reduce risk. So I see a couple of questions, so I think I'll just jump into them as we've been going. So let's see here. Sometimes PO, that's product owner, is hands-off and leans too much on user interface to make decisions. So what I would say is that you definitely want to make sure, especially for data science. So again, I'm going to answer this from the data science team's perspective. You want to make sure that the product owner is the person that's helpful in understanding what would be useful. So, sometimes in terms of what the user interface looks like, the product owner might defer a little bit on that in terms of a dashboard and how to exactly lay out a dashboard. Product owner might be like, well, there's somebody else that's a better expert in that. But in terms of what's the key information to present in a dashboard, or in terms of, for a predictive model, how do we value false negatives and false positives, right? So that's the person that might have to lean on other experts to understand even what a false positive is, right? So the product owner might not understand that concept. So the team needs to educate the product owner enough so that the product owner can explain how the work will be used, why something is important, kind of the framework, if you will, the context around it, and to think through that. And that really is the key role of the product owner. And, sometimes I was just working with a company yesterday where the question was asked, do we need to kind of explain the role of the product owner to the product owner? The answer is definitely yes. So some product owners will understand what their role is, and some will just be kind of, pushed out by the stakeholders and be like, yeah, sure, I'm the product owner. But you need to make sure that person understands what it is, what that means. Needs to understand what's going on. Let's see here. I'm going to read another question. One challenge we faced in implementing sprints was mid-sprint injections of basically of additional things to do, right? And that's where you need to be clear that, and that's where a Scrum Master or process expert is really the person that should protect the team and say, those are great ideas, we're going to finish the sprint, and then we'll talk about what to do next. It's also why you want the sprints to be as small as possible, right? So that's why almost no team does 4-week sprints. 4-week sprints is totally fine in Scrum. It's part of the standard. It would not be an issue. But that's an awful long time to push off things that come up. 1 week, and if you're 2 days into it, it's like 3 days, let's just finish this. Let's make sure we're going to learn from this, and then we're going to move forward. And that's a discussion. And the Scrum Master is the person that can, if the C-suite's like pounding the table, like we just uncovered this thing and it's really important, fine, admit, let's just cancel the current sprint and let's reprioritize and go forward. That's okay, that would be fine too. But adding things to the sprint is putting the team at risk because they already kind of have a sense of what they can do in that 1 week. So like, how are you going to add stuff to it? You're going to expect people to work overtime? You can do that every once in a while, yes, but like, should not be part of the process. So in Scrum, teams work overtime if they misscope how long things take. Then I would say, yeah, you committed to doing this in a week. You got to get it done in a week. And I don't care how long you have to work. But in general, like you don't put other work that the team didn't commit to getting it done. And that's where, if you will, the process expert needs to back up and say, look, this is our process. This is how it works. And explain it. And explain it to the product owner as well, who then can kind of go to the C-suite. So let's see here. Another question. Could I say more about who an ideal product owner should be for a data science team? Let me see. So would I see it being the data science manager? So that's a great question. I would see it often not being a data science manager. In fact, anytime I see it being a data science manager, lots of alarm bells go off in my head that it's being an engineering-driven, data science-driven project, and that's really bad. So the way I think about it is it's the person that's from the organization that would use that's being developed. So, sometimes that might be somebody in the data science team, but typically I would like to think of it as somebody in the business, so to speak. And again, it could be an internal team, but it's the person that would help ensure that it's going to be used. It's the person that would help define the new business process. Again, that could be an internal business process. It could be a client-facing business process. If you're a consulting organization, it would ideally be somebody that's part of the organization that you're consulting with to kind of help give you an understanding. It's the person that better understands it from the business perspective as well as from a technology perspective. It's really concerning to me if it's a manager of the data science team, because they're not going to understand those trade-offs as well as somebody else. And also, it's a way to facilitate the communication. And this is really important. Because if it's the product owner that's prioritizing and that product owner is part of the business, then they're part of that conversation about what to do and why to do it and how long it'll take. If it's all being done on the data science team with the data science manager, then the business, if you will, it's kind of much easier for them to lose context about what's being done. And also, like, why that iteration failed. Like, why did you do that in the first place? If it's the product owner that was really part of the business that kind of, this is what we should do, this is what we should learn, and at the end of the day, we learned that this data has no predictive value. Like that was a group collective decision as opposed to just a data science team's decision. So I think it's a great question, and hopefully I kind of added something there, right? Let's see, somebody just added, I think, a comment, but I'll read that out. We find that the product owner, when in the business, doesn't want to do all the paperwork. Paperwork and process, I think there's different ways to manage that. I think there's different ways to structure that. But I think at the end of the day, you still want to make sure that product owner is in the business and is making that decision. You can talk about streamlining who's documenting what's going in where, but it's important that that person is part of the decision process. Again, it could be that there's some support for that product owner, but that product owner needs to understand what's going on, I guess maybe is how I try to differentiate that. You see there, is there a different product owner for each model that is being built or the same product owner over all the models? That's a great question to clarify. So what I would say is it depends a little bit if your question was on two models for the same problem. Let me tip something really simple. A predictive model about who will accept a marketing campaign. And you might actually have 3 or 4 different models that might work, and you're trying to determine which one's the best. All of that is one project from my perspective, and you're trying to figure out the best model. And so for any given project, you have one product owner. But if you were thinking about models being different about, predictive models about who's going to accept a marketing campaign and a different predictive model about machine maintenance, just to kind of pick something totally different. Those you probably would have two different product owners. So I try to think about it in terms of the project, not in terms of the model, and maybe in terms of like the business process that needs to be changed to see how different they are. So if it's two different uses of models, oftentimes it's going to be two different product owners. If we're just talking about like what's the best model, then it's always the same product owner because it's one project. Thanks for those questions. Let's see here. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I've talked about product backlog a little bit. I just want to kind of, again, just share a little bit, right? So the idea of a product backlog in general in Scrum is thinking about it as features to be added. You can think about these as user stories of capabilities of how to kind of, the product might be more useful. You can think of it as a desired list of work items. So all of those make sense. But what I'll say from a data science perspective is that I like to think of the product backlog as questions to be answered or maybe hypotheses to be evaluated. And because I think, the reason why I think that's useful in data science is it reinforces the concept that there's unknowns and we're trying to answer a question. So the answer might be, yes or no in a simplest way, but oftentimes it's obviously much more nuanced than that. But rather than saying we're going to do X, it's like we're going to answer a question, and that question will basically provide more clarity on what the project is and obviously move the project forward as well. So I find oftentimes trying to think about these user stories in that context is helpful from a data science perspective. So I'll spend a little bit of time. I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but there's still a bunch of people that don't have the full understanding of this. So when we start a sprint, we need to kind of plan what goes into the sprint. And so we need to prioritize all the different backlog items. We need to select what the goal of the sprint is. And then we need to plan the team itself. The technical team kind of divides it up into small tasks. And that often gets put into a Kanban board. And you can see what goes into prioritization is pretty much all the knowledge of everything that's been done. And this is what we reprioritize each time we start a new sprint. And then it goes into the sprint backlog. This daily meeting, this meeting is very short. If it's taking too long, then the process is not working well. If team members find this not useful, probably not focus on the right things in this short meeting. By far, the most important thing to be focused on is like what obstacle is in your way for doing your work today. It's also important to remember that this is not where you solve that problem. This is where you identify the problem, and then there's some other, SWAT team, if you will, that will help to solve the problem. Or maybe it just gets escalated to management, whatever the case might be. But you're not solving it there. So, Scrum for data science. It works on software teams. It works in many other fields. So, maybe it works for data science. It's definitely good that it works and focuses on customer value. This regular cadence of sprints is very good. It helps you, again, reprioritize what you're doing on a regular basis, creates and facilitates communication with the product owner and the stakeholders. The team itself, it promotes autonomy about how to kind of prioritize things. So if you notice, there wasn't like some C-suite person weighing in on how to kind of achieve it. It's the team itself that understands what can go into a sprint, how to prioritize what happens in a sprint and things like that. And the last one here is both a positive and a negative, depending on your team and your culture. So these sprints create a sense of urgency to finish the work in that week time period or 2-week time period, if that's the case. Some people really like that. Many managers really like that. Some teams think it also maybe facilitates a little bit of burnout because of this constant sense of urgency. There's different ways to kind of manage through that, but it's something to think through both from a positive and negative. So what's hard about using Scrum for data science? And what I'll say is, if you Google Scrum and data science, there's lots of data scientists that have wrote blog posts on that. And the vast majority, quite honestly, are negative. The short answer that I'll summarize, 50 blog posts in, I tried Scrum for data science, and it's just like, I'm not going to use it going forward. So there's some data scientists on the call. Maybe some of them have used it, some of them haven't. But so what are the challenges? Rather than just saying it's like it doesn't work, like let's think about like what makes it hard for Scrum to work in a data science context. So if you remember one of the early slides I had, I think it was 73% of data scientists said that task estimation was unreliable, was a challenge. Well, if you're trying to figure out what goes into a week or 2-week sprints, doesn't really matter. And 3/4 of the people or 3/4 of the projects, it's really hard to figure out what can be done in a week or two. That's a fundamental problem with the process. And so what happens when you can't estimate it, one of two things happens. So either the team just works crazy when they misestimate to try to make it into that week. And that can work for a little bit, but then what typically happens is the sprints don't finish on time. It's like, well, it took longer than we think, so the sprint's not really done, but we'll still plan for the next sprint. And it just breaks down all the value of having sprints and getting feedback after those iterations, after the sprints from the stakeholders and from the product owner. All of it starts to break down. And so all the benefits that teams get from using Scrum kind of start to disappear. So they start to still have the concept of sprints, but not real sprints. They have the concept of product owner, but the product owner is really not engaged because they don't really know when sprints end, and things just start to fall apart. So it sounds like a simple little thing, but it's a fundamental issue, right? So if you don't know how long your work is going to take, how do you know what you can do in a week or two? Another thing is that, again, all sprints need to be the same length, a week or 2 weeks. But sometimes logically in a data science project, some things will logically just be smaller and we can learn something from it, and some things might need to take a longer amount of time. So it might be that even if we could estimate, we would know that this task is going to take 3 days. And this other task, collectively, like we can't break it down anything smaller than 2 weeks. And so that is really hard in Scrum to figure out how to do with that. So the 3-day one, you can add some other things to it to try to make something logical. But again, it's not going to be fully logical. It's two things that are kind of put together. The third thing is that a sprint is like a burst of work. And sometimes there's tasks, that really aren't a burst of work, but take time. So training a model, depending on what you're doing, actually might take days. And so how does that fit into this concept of what's going on in a sprint is a little problematic. So here are 3 fundamental issues that cause data science teams to struggle. I see a bunch of questions here, so I think this is probably a good time to take a look at this. How do you implement Scrum when business priorities shift or product owners can't clearly define priorities? So let me talk about priorities shifting. So I think actually Scrum is good when business priorities shift. And there's 2 levels where priorities can shift. So in one level, they can shift basically from one project to another. Well, if that's the case, then you just stop one project to start another. But much more often, the project itself is refining what they want based on better understanding. That happens a lot in data science. Again, the more insight you get from the data, the better you can define what you want the model to do, for example. And so in that case, having these iterations is helpful because, again, it's assumed that you need agility. You need to be non-linear, if you remember, that we can pivot, and that's okay. Just need a structured way to do that so everyone's on the same page and it doesn't look like wasted effort. Like if you learn something and you need to kind of pivot to a different direction, that's that non-linear we're talking about, and you need a structure to do that, and Scrum really works well for that. And again, for product owners not being able to clearly define priorities, again, the product owner is the one that's defining what to do next. And so if the product owner can't define what to do next, the team needs to take a step back and understand why that is. Is it that the product owner doesn't understand the real goal that might be useful? Is it the product owner might not understand some incremental steps that would add value? And so there needs to be a discussion between at least some members of the technical team and the product owner to help clarify why that is. So there's a question here about what estimation method did you use? So I didn't really talk about estimation methods. There's definitely different types of estimation methods. Many Scrum teams use story points, for example, where they kind of give relative effort of one task over another. What I'll say is that, and you need some type of estimation to figure out what can go into a sprint, whether that's a week or 2 weeks. But what I'll say is that, it's many data science teams have found that no matter what method they're using to do estimation, it's not the method that's hard, it's the fact that it's really hard to estimate how long it is. So whatever method you're using, it's still going to be problematic. But there are many different methods. And I'll talk about some higher level ones that we can use also. Retrospectives are valuable in software projects. Any difference with data science? So I haven't talked about retrospectives yet, but I should right now, actually. That's a good point. So retrospective is a meeting that should be held on a regular basis. In Scrum, it's pretty much used after in every project, after every iteration. You're kind of taking a look at what we can do better. And it's a special meeting where you're kind of treating your project as a process, or you're treating your process as a project, and the team collectively defines what to improve in. So that's really important. That's a solid thing that works in data science as well as every other kind of use of Scrum. What I will say, though, is sometimes it doesn't make sense. It might make sense to meet monthly to do retrospectives rather than weekly, for example, or something like that. We can talk about that a little bit. But the concept of using a retrospective, which again is a way to improve your process and incrementally improve your process and have specific deliverables about what you're going to do. So a retrospective is not where everybody just sits and complains about how the process is broken. You can do that, but it's about suggesting what to do better. And then the team and the Scrum Master and the Scrum perspective is the one that listens to all these, facilitates that conversation, and prioritizes what to do next. So if you want to think about the process as being a product, then the Scrum Master is the product owner and prioritizes what to do next. And that process of having the entire team think about their process, what they can do better. Maybe they can make their stand-ups more efficient by doing certain things, whatever the case might be. That's a really useful thing across any team. Let's see here. Another question is, looking at CRISP-DM with Scrum, which phases are within the Scrum and what should be done before or after the work item? So that's a really good question. I could have spent a lot of time talking about how to think about kind of integrating Scrum and CRISP-DM. What I'll say is that at a conceptual level, it's helpful to think about each sprint conceptually going through each of the different lifecycle phases of CRISP-DM. It might be that you only need one or two of those phases, but conceptually you want to at least ask, okay, so we have this sprint goal, and is this about business understanding, about data understanding? Is it about, modeling, whatever the case might be? And it might be little bits of each of those. That's in some sense the ideal scenario, because you're incrementally improving your knowledge across all of those. But lots of times you can't do all of them for lots of reasons, and that's okay. But you want to be clear about what's going on in a sprint, and you can use that vocabulary of CRISP-DM or whatever your life cycle is to make it clear to people where you're focusing this sprint on. Another question here, can you have a technical sprint where you do not work on new functions but correct technical debts? So I didn't go over what technical debt was, but you can think of technical debt as being something that is kind of creates a more reusable model, kind of keep on this simple thing. And I think you definitely can have sprints that work on things that are creating a more effective solution going forward. And it just needs to be prioritized with everything else, right? So, and it needs to be understood by the product owner what the value is. And so the technical team needs to explain what the technical debt is, why this one's really important. Another example could be scalability. So the solution works, but if we double the number of predictions, the system's going to start to collapse on itself. It won't scale well. So some people view that as technical debt, some people don't. It really depends on what's driving that. But that can be phrased in a way that a product owner can help prioritize that. So again, it's just, answering a question. The question can be, can we scale to a certain value, or something like that. So I think this helps to explain why many, if I take a look at kind of these challenges, why many data scientists maybe were intuitively drawn to Scrum because it's working, but then push back, or don't even push back. They try to use it, it starts to break down. They don't really understand why it's breaking down. And then, it's just like, well, I tried it for 3 months and it was just like bureaucracy and it didn't really add any value. And it's some combination of these that's driving that. So we've been asking questions, so I'm going to do that. And let me see here. There's one last one. Super helpful to have action items after stand-up to track them. Yes. So again, the stand-up, this is the daily meeting that occurs. There's lots of different ways. I've even seen teams do this virtually. The key is what's blocking you from doing your work. You can't have that kind of just be there and not have people know about it. So the daily meeting is a way to make sure everybody knows about it and to get the right people to help address it. And you should definitely treat those as action items that are worked outside of that meeting. And that action might be done by a manager. It might be done by a technical person. It might be you need kind of the senior technical people to brainstorm what the solution is. All those are possible outcomes. But you want to treat it as something that's teed up, but not discussed at the stand-up. There's a big difference between those two. So I want to talk a little bit about another agile framework called data-driven Scrum. So data-driven Scrum, so I helped create it, so obviously I think it's probably pretty good, but my goal here isn't that you should definitely use data-driven Scrum. My goal here is for you to think about, how you might adapt Scrum to work in your situation. Maybe data-driven Scrum is really useful, maybe something else is useful, but you need something that works for data science. And I think just using Scrum as is, for many teams, is problematic. So it tries to kind of really focus on two key challenges that people have when they're using Scrum. So first, task estimation is unreliable, and hence what goes into a sprint is really hard. And also this smaller and larger chunks of work from a logical perspective is probably maybe a little bit more important in data science than maybe in some other areas, as we've had to refine what to do next. So DDS tries to kind of adhere to that. So here are kind of four key principles. So Agile is intended to be a sequence of iterative experiments, and we adapt after each one. That actually is true in Scrum and data-driven Scrum, right? You want to do these, I'll use the word experiments in data science, but you can think of that as being sprints. Each iteration should have an idea and experiment and how to evaluate the results. Again, if you want to think about it as answering a question or doing a hypothesis, then we need to kind of be able to answer that question. We need to be able to kind of know the results of the hypothesis. Again, that makes total sense in Scrum. You don't need any variant of Scrum to make that work. The basis of an iteration should be an idea, being able to kind of really fully answer the question. From the idea to the question to the analysis of the results. That's really, I think, still in the spirit of what Scrum is. So these first three is really Scrum would be like, yeah, those all make total sense. It's this last one that differentiates Scrum from data-driven Scrum. So this completion of this whole process of answering a question should mark the end of an iteration, not a predefined time-based time box of 1 week, for example. So if we can answer a question in 3 days, great. If we can answer a question in 2 weeks, well, if that's what it took, that's what it took. But trying to kind of fit everything into 1 week chunks causes lots of problems. So let's acknowledge the fact that we don't know exactly how it's going to work. And that's kind of the key thing here is let's answer the question in that iteration before we move to the next iteration, as opposed to kind of trying to kind of mess things up as we're trying to do different sprints. So a different way to think about this, right? So we need to decouple meetings from an iteration. And why is that? And that's because we have these capability-based iterations that I kind of highlight there, right? So if an iteration is 3 days or 7 days, we can't meet on a regular basis at the end of each iteration, just from a conceptual perspective, right? If I need to talk to a product owner, it might be I need to talk to them at the end in 7 days, 6 days, 5 days, right? Meetings don't work that way in most organizations. So if you can do it that way, great, but it's just typically doesn't work that way. So we want to kind of have meetings on a regular cadence, but acknowledge that our iterations don't finish on a regular cadence. Another thing that's kind of a key pillar is that we only need high-level estimation. So in Scrum, we need to kind of have some detailed level of estimation so we can figure out what goes into a sprint. But since we have capability-based iterations, we just want a high level. And what do I mean by high level? So some people use the word t-shirt size estimation, so small, medium, large, extra large, that type of description. And that's important because there could be two different tasks that might, answer two different questions we want to answer. And each of them might provide roughly the same value to the project. But one might be, an extra large and one might be a small. And so you would do the small one first if they kind of provide pretty much the same value because you can learn from that and go forward. So you want to give the product owner some understanding of roughly how long things will take. So they have an understanding of, look, we expect it to take 3 to 5 days. It could take long, it could take shorter. We expect it to take 2 weeks. We could be off by that. So they have some understanding of when they're making the trade-offs. So these are the kind of the key concepts behind, DDS. And again, so an iteration, I call it an iteration, not a sprint, because it's not a fixed time block. It's a fixed amount of work that we're going to get done. So we're going to answer a question that'll take how long it takes. And and each iteration creates something, then we basically need to analyze what that was created. So we obviously have to do some type of observation of what was created, and then do an analyze. And that's because we want to learn from that, and so we want to think directly about how do we learn in a data science context. So I talked about create, observe, analyze. So again, each iteration needs to create something. And it could be the creation doesn't have to be a predictive model. It could be the creation of clean data. Then we want to do something about observation of that. So even if it's just about cleaning data, we might want to do some measurements of how clean the data is, for example. And then we need to analyze the results. So this makes perfect sense if we're building a predictive model, but it makes perfect sense if we're trying to answer a different type of question. And we want to make sure in each iteration we're doing all of these so we can learn after an iteration to prioritize future iterations. So again, we want iterations to be as short as possible. That's going back to what I talked about before. And so you can think about the flow of work being, and this kind of can work in Scrum or data-driven Scrum, brainstorm what to do, prioritize what to do. Then we want to create something, we want to observe and analyze it, and that feedback will help brainstorm and reprioritize what's going forward. And so you kind of have this circular work of where you're kind of learning and going forward. I'll point out one higher level concept, which is a product increment, which exists in many agile approaches, including data-driven Scrum. And that's like a higher level concept than a sprint or an iteration. You can think of it being 3 months or 6 months. Maybe you can think of it as being version 1 of a product. And the team knows that at the end of that, 6 months, we're going to release something. But you're doing these iterations during that time. And what you're doing is you're prioritizing what you're doing, maybe more exploratory at the start of an increment. And as you get towards the end, the team needs to stop doing exploratory work and more towards what can be used in a production environment, for example. So you're going to do multiple iterations in a product increment, but it helps the team prioritize across different things about what to do going forward for version 1 versus version 2. Question here. I understand it takes what it takes, which has to do with, I'm sure, an iteration, how long it is. But the data scientist will take infinity. So I like the time box sprints because it puts a constraint on how long it is. So what I want to say there is, so a data scientist, a couple different perspectives some people have. So some people think that data science will take infinity. Some people think that I can't trust the data science team to kind of work hard if they don't have a deadline. And I think when you say a data scientist will take infinity, that's because you didn't clearly articulate what we should do in that iteration. So an iteration is not build a model that's perfect, right? That will take infinity. It could be do a first iteration. What iteration can be build a model using kind of a simple neural network on this data. That does not take infinity, right? And it could be there could be descriptions about how to tune that model. So there's different things, and obviously we could talk about lots of different examples based on what the project is, even if you're not using neural networks or whatever the case might be. But the goal here is the iteration is not to build the model that you're going to deploy. You have to decide, like, a question that can be answered. Like, so can we improve this model by X% in the time we have? Or can we build a model that includes an additional data attribute, and what does that do? So you stop the process of trying to build a perfect model. And I think that in general is something that many data scientists struggle with, is when is good enough? And that's where you need to kind of have the product owner be accountable for, like, this is what we're trying to achieve in this iteration. And then we'll talk about what to do in next iteration. And there's nothing wrong with the data scientist trying to build a perfect model, but there's something wrong with having that define the priority of the project and how long it takes. So I think, that's a challenge that the process needs to make sure as you're collectively and collaboratively working. A data scientist might be like, I need time to improve the model. And the product owner can be, well, like, what's your gut feel of how much you can improve? How long will it take? And the product owner can be like, the minimal viable product that I have from a model perspective is 80%. So try to get there. And then let's talk about what it might take to improve it to 85%. I'm just giving you examples. That gives you a feel for it. So it's collaborative, and there's nothing wrong with trying to build a perfect model that takes forever, but that needs to be signed off on by the entire team, and it needs to be done in small iterations where each thing can be kind of a useful thing. Is a sprint girl crafted correctly? I'm gone back to the questions here. So yes, so the sprint goal, or in GDS, the iteration goal. So as I mentioned before, the product owner is the person that's accountable to define what it is, but everybody contributes to ideas, to kind of an explanation of why different things are important. And that's true with technical debt, or improving the model, or maybe suggesting new data that can be fed into the model that can improve the model, for example. So it's the entire team that has suggestions that can go into the product backlog. And it's the entire team that tries to make sure that the product owner understands the trade-offs of each of those. But at the end of the day, then it's the product owner that picks it. How to identify the line from exploratory to production. So that's something that the team needs to think through. And that's why the product owner needs to be part of, like, what's this MVP? What's the minimum viable product? And that's important in understanding, how accurate the model needs to be, both in positive, false negatives, false positives, all of that type of discussion. And there needs to be, like, what's the minimal thing we're trying to get to? And then once you get to that, it might be, all right, so now let's start to look at productionalizing that as opposed to improving that model. But that's where the dialogue and communication is really, really important, because it's not like one answer is always correct. For that project, in that context, in that organization, there's going to be correct answers. But the product owner understands part of that answer. The lead data scientist and other data scientists understand other parts of it. And by having the product owner accountable, it forces the data science team to share their insights about what they're doing, about what it takes to get to production, what it takes to improve the model. And it forces the product owner to be like, okay, so this is useful and this is not useful. And everybody talking about timelines associated with all those different trade-offs. So what's exploratory, what's production? Those are great questions. And that's why it's really important to have that communication. And that's why just having a data science lifecycle is not enough. Just saw another question here. I want to be sure I understand. Okay, a milestone might be a model with 80% accuracy, version 1, and another with version 2, et cetera. Yes, so you can have that 80% versus 90% be a product increment, and there could be different things you're trying to achieve within that increment. So I might use different versions of a model to try to improve accuracy. I might tune parameters to try to improve accuracy. I might try to incorporate new data, but I might treat version 1 as being 80% and version 2 being, 90% as a goal. And then I use this increment concept to say, how long are we trying to achieve? And I also understand, as we're getting closer to the end result of that product increment, if I'm using data-driven Scrum, it might be we can't get to 90% in that 3 months, but we understand what's possible and why we're going to move that to production. Again, all about trying to make sure everybody's on the same page, and that each iteration, we're reducing ambiguity, we're reducing risk, we're reducing uncertainty, and we have a better sense of, can we get to 90% or not? Another question just came up. How do you handle the complexity of each data scientist iterations being at different stage in the Scrum meetings? So I probably need a little bit of more context for that. But what I'll say is that, one of the roles that the data scientist needs to be able to do is to be able to explain the work they're doing in an iteration that is understandable by the product owner, right? So that's why I like to say we're trying to answer this question. And sometimes it's not answering a question, you might phrase it a different way. But you need to be able to explain the value of the iteration and the risk of the iteration. And, each team member might be working on different things, but as a team, what are you trying to achieve? And what's the risk of that? And what do we try to do in this iteration? Why is it important? And at the end of the iteration, having everybody kind of take a step back. What did we learn? And so failure is okay because we're just answering a question. You're not failing. You answered a question. The question might not be the answer you wanted, but you're answering that question. It might be, for example, that new data does not help improve the model. That's still an answer to the question. I wouldn't call that a failure. And at the start of that iteration, everybody agreed that let's take a look at that new data because it kind of intuitively makes sense it could work. So that's how to kind of think about that. Another question is, I think the issues on this approach is to explain or sell that the model is 80% accurate. What is the value of using it? Right, so that's where the product owner is important because in some instances, 80% is not at all useful. In some, 80% is like way beyond, like let's just start at 70. And so that's where the team needs to collectively understand the value of models. And again, we're using 70%, 80%. Like sometimes false positives and false negatives are not equal, even though in that 80% they are. And so that's where the team needs to collectively understand it. And that's where, when you're kind of going through different iterations, that's why it's the product owner that needs to, understand it. And that's where the data scientists need to explain things in a way that the product owner can understand. So maybe you can't use false positives and false negatives in your description of what's going on, but the data scientist will be able to kind of explain it in a way that makes sense in the context of those predictions. So I think these are good questions. I think what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about a process scorecard. You can keep asking questions. I'll answer them as we're kind of going through, but this might be a different way to kind of think about process, good process. And I think part of this discussion at the end really highlighted that you need a vocabulary to talk about where you are in the project, but like this communication about what to achieve in an iteration. So you're not trying to generate a perfect model. But you are trying to identify what's useful. And then once you have something useful, you kind of move it to production, if you will. And production means different things in different contexts. So here's a high-level view of different process components. And I'll talk about each of them a little bit. But you can think about filling in the scorecard for any group. And you can kind of come up with a total score. And we can kind of go through that. So let's see here. So the first one is obviously the team has a shared mental model of the steps in the project. That's the data science lifecycle, right? So if I ask the product owner what the steps of a project are, the person might need to go to a slide to look at the picture, but then understands that picture. The second one is very much related to that. It's that it's actually used, right? So it's one thing to have a shared mental model, but maybe it's not fully defined, or maybe it's defined but not used, or whatever the case might be. So there's a shared mental model, it's defined, and people actually use it as they're talking about it. The next group of questions deal with agile coordination. So the team delivers value incrementally to stakeholders, right? So at the end of the day, as you remember from kind of one of my early things, if you want to be agile, you have to have small increments, right? Whether they're Scrum sprints, whether they're DDS increments that are capability-based, something else, but you need to do small increments. And the second part here is you need to learn from each increment. So you need to get feedback from stakeholders, or from the product owner if you want, which is I view as the lead stakeholder. So just doing small increments is part of it, but you need to get like the feedback from each iteration. And then the third part of agile kind of coordination at the highest level is that there's a collective view of prioritizing what to do next based on the feedback of this iteration and other iterations. So you're doing iterations, you're getting feedback, and then you're prioritizing, right? So are you doing all three of those? Lots of different ways to implement it, but that's really important, and is the team doing that? Then in terms of like process improvement and kind of how things are, so there's how as a team integrated the life cycle and the coordination framework. So there was a question before about, do we do each life cycle step in one iteration? And again, there's different ways to do that. I've got some blog posts on it. You can reach out to me afterwards. Again, you can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily. But you need to be clear about how that integration is. Then the next question is, does the team use defined metrics to measure success? And I can think about that in two dimensions. So does the team have metrics to measure success of a project? Those are business metrics, right? Depending on what the business is, it might be different. But like you're measuring success not from a technical perspective, but from the organizational perspective that was funding the project. There might also be metrics, obviously, in terms of how the team is working effectively and things like that. And then finally, number 8 there is this concept of a retrospective. So it's really important to try to improve your process as you go forward. So it doesn't have to be after each iteration, but it needs to be on some regular basis, and you're tracking those process improvements. That's really important. So you're not just talking about what's not working well, you're getting suggestions about what to improve. The process expert is taking a look at which ones make the most sense at the end of a retrospective, the end of a process improvement meeting. The group decides we're going to do these 3 things, try to improve it. And when you get back together again for your next retrospective, you're going to take a step back and say, did we achieve these? Did these help? And then kind of go through this process again. So you're treating your process like a project, and you're like, what should we be doing to improve it? Lots of different things that might be done to improve it. Nothing's ever perfect. And even if you can't wholeheartedly just change things, if you start incrementally improving your process, things will get better quickly. In terms of like knowledge and model management, so can models be recreated and shared? So this is different than code. This is something that people need to think about, right? So when you're building a simple neural network or a complicated model, you know, many times it's based on data as part of what you need to build the model. So, you know, you can snapshot, if you will, your Python code as an example, but you also need to snapshot the data that was used to build the model. And you need to think about, is that important or is that not important? How is that working in your organization? And then finally, there's tools, right? So there's all different types of tools. I'm not here to say like tool A is great and tool B is not good, but you know, what facilitates your work? And you can also think about tools to facilitate your work as being part of your retrospective, right? So you're not only improving the process, but you're improving the tools that help you kind of streamline your process. Let's see, so a couple questions. Value in generating outcomes versus just output. So that's really important, right? So when I talk about, you know, measuring results, for example, and when I talk about insights that are actionable and useful, I definitely want to make sure people are thinking about that in terms of how is the organization using the predictive model, as opposed to the predictive model is 80% versus 82%. It's, no, we deployed the model and this was the end result that was, you know, generated value to the organization. So I think it's really important that you analyze and look at, and the product owner feels accountable to understand how the project was a success from that perspective. You can definitely have other metrics, but that's really important. Let's see. So yeah, so you can use lots of different processes. There was a comment there on Kanban. So Kanban is a really useful tool that can be used in data-driven Scrum, can be used in Scrum, can be used in other processes. At the heart of Kanban is the concept of you have a visual board and you see where tasks are, you see where roadblocks are, you see where kind of tasks start to age. There's different ways to do that. And so I kind of view Kanban as both a tool because it's a visual board, as well as a process where you're kind of trying to do things in a very lean environment. It works well with Agile, as I said, when people are working on iterations or sprints, lots of times there's a Kanban board for that. So I think I want to kind of ask a question here, which is, as we've been going over data science process, I talked about lifecycle usage. I talked about Agile coordination. I talked about process improvement. And I talked a little bit about knowledge management and model management. And so I'm kind of curious about, you know, which you think are most important. So I'll kind of give people a minute or two to see this, make a vote, like which one, if you had to pick only one thing, like what's the most important dimension here as we think through things? I'll give people a minute or two to think through this. And again, you know, there's different aspects of data lifecycle usage, right? So there's many different life cycles one could use. There's many different coordination frameworks. So I'll give people maybe another 5-6 seconds to answer this. Let's see, a couple of questions, a couple of answers. That's good. People 3 more seconds and then I'll show the results. Still a couple more. Maybe I think people were thinking about this one a little bit more than the others before they answer, which is good. I'll give people another 10 seconds or so. All right, let's see. So it's fairly well spread out. I would say that as you can see here is Agile coordination was the top, but the second most and fairly close was process improvement, followed by lifecycle usage, and then tied with knowledge and model management. So obviously it depends on the projects. If I had to pick one thing, I think I probably said this at the beginning, I would pick process improvement because with process improvement, I'll improve my Agile coordination. With process improvement, I'll define a life cycle that's useful. I'll define a life cycle that's shared. With process improvement, I'll talk about model management, for example. So I think if I had to pick one thing, my personal view would be to pick process improvement, just because I think with that, I can get a better process. If, on the other hand, I'm thinking about, like, I talked about like the 2 key dimensions being life cycles and agile coordination. If I had to think about which one of those two is more important, I would agree with what people said here, which is the fact that, this agile coordination is really, really critical. You do need life cycle to make sure that people are on the same page about what tasks are, but this coordination and kind of getting people to understand about what to do next and having things in small bursts of work, that's kind of, I think, certainly fundamental to how things go forward. So this will be the last slide I show on kind of the benchmarking area. I'll just show kind of some best practices. I think these now should not be too surprising, so I'll just talk through them a little bit. And so what we can see here in the life cycle, so a shared mental model is used and defined. It includes quality, so validation type of quality, as well as maybe bias and things like that, right? So we have to kind of think about that holistically. It includes operational support. Some people call this ML ops, data ops. And it's understood by the extended team. So I think all of that's kind of part of the life cycle part. The agile coordination part, I like to think about a prioritized list of questions to be answered. The questions are small. This is an important one. The team acknowledges ambiguities, right? It knows that some of the questions either, we won't have the answers to the questions we want, or it'll be hard to answer the questions, or there's ambiguity about how long things will take. And this is important to help set expectations about, like, what do we know and what don't we know. Each iteration has analysis and feedback, right? So we're learning from each iteration is like really, really important. And that the project goals and timelines are understood. And I think that's obviously sometimes implicit, but I think it's really key. And then process improvement and coordination, right? So we have defined business metrics. We have a project defined, and we're kind of measuring things in lots of different ways. We can talk about how we integrate the two processes. So vertically sliced process integration, we can think about that as being kind of this approach I talked about, which is we go through each phase of the life cycle conceptually across each iteration, but sometimes we just say it might not be applicable. But there's lots of other ways to do process integration, so we just have a very clear way of how we're thinking about that. There's regular process reviews, in other words, retrospectives. Equally important that we're tracking what we're doing. And that's important. And then the model and knowledge management I talked about before. We have models that are versioned and recreatable if that's important in the business. If it's not, there's some way at least to re-leverage the code as we go forward, maybe for a different type of project. And finally, at least the Scrum Master or process expert is focused on tool usage and like how do we improve that, right? So what tools are out there in data science? Tools are still being developed all the time, and what might be useful today versus 2 years from now versus 2 years ago. Well, that's important. And I'll give, in terms of like project goals and timelines are understood. Everybody is on the same page. One of the metrics I like to ask, it's not business metrics, but it'll give you an idea of how things, how you can kind of think about things. One of the questions I like to ask on a weekly basis is what percentage of the time this week did you spend on your top two priorities? And that's, it doesn't have to be an exact number. It's just kind of a question you can answer on a Friday afternoon, for example. So it literally takes 10 seconds. And you'd be surprised about the number of teams where I say, do you ask this question? And there's a pause and be like, well, that would mean I'd have to know my top two priorities. And yeah, that's exactly right. And so kind of that's just an example of a kind of a team metric that can be very useful to make sure we're prioritizing things correctly and we're communicating correctly, and that everybody's on the same page about what is most important, and how much time are we spending on project management stuff or lower level stuff or whatever the case might be versus these top priorities. So that's just kind of an example of where we're at. So taking a step back, some of the things I hope you gain